Hello, hello, and welcome to a special edition of the History of the Everyday Schools. We've all spent every day of our lives in school at some point, at least I hope so, and we have enjoyed every single minute of it, at least I hope so. So, you may think you know all there is to know about school, but we shall see. So, a quick disclaimer with this video. I am not going to pretend that I'm going to trace the entire history of every school that ever existed. Schools in some way, shape, or form have been around for thousands upon thousands of years. They were informal academies. They were different schools for different skills, trade skills, apprenticeships, all of those things. That is not going to be the subject of this video, in fact. Because in most societies, formal schooling, as we know it, universal education, was fairly rare to non-existent. So for today, we shall in fact explore the first emergence of what we could recognize as modern schooling, which began in the Victorian era. So we are talking the second half of the 1800s or the second half of the 19th century. Now, who went to school in Victorian times? Well, two specific groups, really. But most children never went to school at all and grew up unable to read or write, what we would call illiterate, unable to read or write. Instead, they were sent out to work and earn money for their families because people were so desperately poor that having an extra 1, 2, 3 sets of incomes from sending your 6-year-old child to work in the factory, an 8-year-old child to deliver the newspapers, or flip that around, that would make all the difference for these families. It was considered a privilege if you had enough money that you didn't need your children to work, and therefore you could send them to school. So school was really only for the rich. So children from rich families were taught at home by a governess. This was a job like similar to an au pair today, but the role would also be for formal education. Well, until they were 10 years old. Once a boy turned 10, he went away to a public school, which, as an Australian, sounds a bit weird to me because public school is what we call school that is available to everyone, whereas in England, public school means private school, which is very, very funny. But anyway, like Eton or Harrow, there were very few schools available for girls, but towards the end of the Victorian time, that began to change. Some wealthier girls or girls who were daughters of influential lords or influential people had the ability to gain an education, but it was very rare. Poor children, where did they go? Well, poor children went to free charity schools, also known as dame schools, because they were run by women. Women would run these schools because they did not necessarily, if they had been able to pursue any education, they would not necessarily find jobs in that field. So they would pass on what they had learned to others. They also went to Sunday schools, which were run by churches. There they learned Bible stories, and in order to read the Bible, obviously they were taught how to read. So in actual fact, the idea that being able to read to become a functioning member of society was not the origins of it. It was, how can you be a good Christian if you can't read the Bible? That is actually the main focus of literacy at that time. Now, poor Victorian children's lives sort of look like this. In 1842, they would be considering work in a factory. They would be considering work in the mines, for example. That was a great job for children because it meant that you didn't have to dig as deep a tunnel or as wide a tunnel. You could just send a bunch of little kids in there and they would do it for you. That begins to change in the second half of the 1800s when education was seen as perhaps a way to cure some ills of society. Whereas you can see in the second half of the 1800s, the lives of rich children didn't necessarily change that much, with the exception of education started becoming more widely accessible, still nowhere near as accessible as it was for boys, but more widely accessible for girls as well. Now, this is where we get this famous quote, which I quite love. This was actually a quote by a prominent Australian activist for education in the 1800s. And this is what he proposed in his letter requesting funding for Queensland to get their education system off the ground. And it said, if the state did not build schools, it would have to build prisons, with the idea being that the uneducated do not have an opportunity. And so, of course, because they can't gain employment, because they don't know how to read, they don't know how to write, they don't know how to count, what do? They commit crime. So educating people wasn't like to help people, it was to stop criminals being an inconvenience to the wealthy. That was basically the way that you could convince political change. Not, hey, I think these people deserve a bit of a hand, they deserve a bit of help, you know, we need to better their lives. No, none of that. It's, hey, our lives are made better by helping those people. If there was nothing in it for the wealthy, why would you do it? Okay. And this little cartoon is sort of suggesting the schoolmaster of the future is, of course, a judge. Now, things begin to make a change. In 1880, an act made education compulsory until the age of 10, following campaigning by the National Education League. Think about that. They actually had to campaign. They weren't just like, hey, do you think we should educate people and have a smarter society? Oh yeah, great idea. Let's do that. They had to campaign for that. They had to convince people that giving people the chance to read, write, count was a good idea for many, many, many years. They had to campaign on that. It wasn't an automatic idea. Now, this was compulsory to the age of 10, with the idea being by the age of 10, they'll be able to read, write, and count. Imagine these days, the average 10-year-old can read fairly well. They can count up to 1,000, a million. They can probably do their times tables. That's good enough. That was the idea back in the day. As long as they can do that, they're fine. They'll be able to get any job they want. This was obviously not considered to be good enough, so they expanded it. How did they expand it? Well, in 1893, it was increased to the age of 11 that you had to stay at school. So problem solved, right? Yeah, I should point out that in Australia, by the 1830s, they were starting to come up with the idea that crime was a result of ignorance. Ignorance was a result of a lack of education, and education would decrease crime. Now, we actually had compulsory education in Australia before 1880, just to point that out. As a matter of fact, it was decided that it would be the only way of turning Australia into an organized and orderly society. This society would be based on, but hopefully better than, the existing British system. That is a direct quote from an official New South Wales government document. So we're going to base it on the British system, but we're going to make it better. Good luck with that. And so this is what you had to learn. This was I love this classic quote. They learned the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Now, hopefully you have spent enough time in school that you can notice only one of those actually starts with R. But this was a way of remembering it. Reading, writing, that actually starts with W, and arithmetic, which actually starts with A. But the idea was, as long as they had a basic command of numbers, your general addition, subtraction, division, multiplication, knowing your alphabet, sound out the big words, that's fine. Another big thing was dictation. So the teacher would literally stand up the front of the room, read out a passage, and kids would have to listen and just write it down word for word. No thinking involved. And they were taught once a week geography, history, and singing. And girls were also taught how to sew. So how did they come up with this idea? Well, the idea was you need to know where you're being posted around the British Empire. So you're going to need a little bit of geography. History was always considered an intellectual pursuit. But when we talk about history, this was mainly history of like Alexander the Great and the Napoleonic Wars and the expansion of the British Empire into India, these sorts of things. History was only taught in terms of how great the British Empire was. Good thing they don't do that anymore. And of course, singing, with the idea being we want our choir to sound pretty good in church on Sundays. Girls were also taught how to sew, but why would you teach that to boys? That would be pointless. Why would they need to know how to repair their own clothing? Please note the sarcasm in my voice. There was also this classic, which they did not get taught necessarily music. If you want to learn an instrument, do that on your own time. They were not taught PE in the way that it was taught now. However, even back in the 1800s, with their terrible, 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 terrible understanding of the world, they still knew that kids, or not just kids, but anyone sitting at a desk all day was bad for them. So there was a thing called drill, and you would do it in the classroom, a series of exercises that are done by the side of your desk. So throughout the school day, all of a sudden the teacher might say, attention, you had to stand up straight in military posture, head up, shoulders back, chest forward, and then you would follow the series of commands. Head to the left, turn, head forward, head to the right, turn. All of these exercises are designed to make sure that children did not develop problems with their posture, and all of the other issues related to sitting at a desk all day long. They needed to be physically fit and physically strong enough to, I don't know, be sent down the mines at age 12 when they're no longer in school. Now then, what was it like to go to school? Well, there could be as many as 70 or 80 people in one class. So imagine that. You've got your hand up and the teacher is looking around at 80 students. The kid next to you with their hand up and the kid next to you with their hand up. That goes down the line for 70 or 80 people in a room. The teachers, obviously, under these conditions, had to be very strict, but they were really, 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 really strict. If you think your teachers were strict, you don't even know what it was like to be in a Victorian classroom, okay? And children were often taught just by reading, copying things down, or chanting things until they were perfect. So it was what we would call rote-based learning. I will tell you the answer, you will memorize the answer. Don't worry about how we got to that answer. Don't worry about why that answer is correct. Just trust me that it is, memorize it. Whatever you do, don't think for yourself. Not the way we do education these days, or at least I hope not. In the school day, well, you would begin with prayers and religious instruction. As I said, the tradition or origins of being able to read and write was to make you a better Christian. Morning lessons ran from 9 a.m. to 12, and oftentimes children would be sent home for lunch. The schools did not provide lunch. So you can imagine if you are from a disadvantaged household and it is time for lunch, the school doesn't feed you, you go home, there's no food there, you have to go back to school from the afternoon classes 2 to 5 p.m. You may not be able to eat in a day, which is pretty ridiculous. But that is a long day, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And that is all with rote learning. No fun activities, no interactions at all. And God forbid if you talk in lesson in a Victorian school. Now, in terms of the school teacher, well, you would be most likely terrified of your school teacher because they were very strict. However, they also employed other students, the older students, if you will, to help control the class. Now, those pupil teachers, as they were known, would scribble notes for their lessons in books. They received certificates, which helped them to qualify as teachers when they were older. So this was a way of making sure teacher training is taking place from a very early age. Now, in schools before 1850, more than 100 children with the help of pupils called monitors. And of course, the idea was you would teach your small group of monitors, your 9 or 10 students, then they would go and talk to another group of 9 or 10 students and do the teaching that way. So you wouldn't teach all 100. You teach you the idea, this is how you count to 10 students. They go and tell another 10 students. Then you come back and teach your monitors that way. Very effective, clearly, the best way to learn. Now, the idea of salaries for teachers was very, very low, and this is the origins of this particular phenomenon, which hasn't necessarily disappeared. But the idea was most teachers were women, so you don't need to pay them a lot because obviously they have husbands that have jobs and have money. You don't need to, women don't need money, men have the money that they will give women. So you don't need to pay teachers very much. Unfortunately, that is still stereotypically the reason that teacher wages around the world remain low. Some people would only teach because they were too ill or too old to do other jobs. So you would often find that a younger woman in her 20s or 30s might be working in a household as a servant or could work in a factory as a seamstress. As they got older, maybe arthritis tends to set in. They can no longer sew. They can't work in the Victorian factories. So they become a school teacher because it can be done with their minds rather than their physical capabilities. Oftentimes, teachers could be attacked by angry parents because parents were so angry sometimes at their children had to be at school instead of out in the factory earning money. In some areas in London, especially, teachers in rough areas were taught how to box so they could protect themselves from these angry parents. This is a classic example, 1872 rules for teachers. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm just going to take out a few quick highlights here. Men teachers may take one evening a week for courting purposes, or 2 evenings a week if they go to church regularly. So the idea was you can take 2 nights off per week. One of those you have to go to church, and one of those is for courting, also known as dating. So you can go and take a lady out for dinner and see if you want to marry her. However, women teachers who marry, so if you're a woman teacher and a man comes and courts you, dates you, takes you out, decides I want to marry you and marries you, you can be fired. You're now married, you no longer need a job, you no longer need money, off you go, see you later. Engage in unseemly conduct, that would be women courting men. So if a woman asks a man out, that is unseemly, you will be fired for that. And if you do your job faithfully, so really, 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 really well, without fault for 5 years, you get an increase of 25 cents a week in his pay. Now, keep in mind that word his. This raise for doing your job perfectly for 5 years only applied to male teachers. Female teachers, on the other hand, you may ride in a buggy with a man if the man is your father or your brother. Otherwise, that would be unseemly conduct and you are fired. Now, don't worry, things got much, much better for teachers by 1915. We've got this set of rules here. You can see here, rule number 1, you will not marry during the term of your contract. If you marry, then you will be fired. You can't be a teacher who's married, obviously. You must be home between the hours of 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. unless attending a school function, which means absolutely no dating, no courting whatsoever. And to keep the schoolroom neat and clean, you must sweep the floor once daily, scrub the floor at least once a week with hot soapy water, clean the blackboards at least once a day, and start the fire by 7 a.m. so the room will be warm by 8 a.m. That's right, not only are you a teacher, you also have to keep the maintenance of that schoolroom, of that school building as well. So you are a caretaker as well as a teacher. Now, there's pupils. Well, children from 5 to 13 had to attend school by law. In winter in the countryside, many children faced teeth-chattering walk to school of several miles. Remember, it was very expensive to build a school. So oftentimes they would build 1 or 2, and wherever you live, that's how you got there. There's no buses, there's no tube. You must walk to school. So many people did not even turn up at all. Remember, the school day is 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. That is a long day. And because of the large size of the classrooms, everyone's doing the exact same thing at exactly the same time. The teacher barks commands, children do exactly as they're told. When pupils find their work boring, teachers found their pupils difficult to control. That is what leads us to this idea of punishment, how you control your students. Now, I point this out, these are news stories from the relatively recent times. The first screenshot here is from 2017. This news story, Bring Back the Cane in Schools, a demand from parents, is from 2011. So the story says almost half of parents said the caning should be brought back to school because caning is how you kept students in line. So teachers handed out regular caning. Schools kept a punishment book that every teacher would have to write in, and the reasons for the use of the cane would be things such as being rude, leaving the playground without permission, sulkiness. So if you're just in a bad mood that day, if you just don't feel like working, you can be caned, answering back. So I want you to finish this by the end of this day, or you don't go to lunch. Oh, that's not fair. Bang, caned. You answered back. Missing Sunday prayers. So even if you're in school on a Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday, if the teacher found out you didn't go to church on the Sunday, they can hit you with the cane. If you were seen throwing ink pellets or throwing anything around the classroom, you could be caned for that. And of course, if you were late. So despite the fact that you may have to walk 8, 9, 10 miles in the middle of winter to school, if you turn up late, you get the cane. Not exactly the best way of doing things. Now, boys were caned across their bottoms and girls across their hands or bare legs. That was considered to be a fair way of doing it. Now, this is another classic Victorian schools punishment, the dunce's cap. So punishment doesn't just end with caning. You might be forced to stand on a stool at the back of the class wearing an armband with dunce written on it. Teacher then took a tall cone-shaped hat decorated with a large D and placed it on the boy's head. Victorian teachers believed that all children could learn at the same speed, and if some fell behind, then they should be punished for not trying hard enough. So, if you had a question, oh, excuse me, sir, excuse me, miss, I'm not sure with this one. Well, you're obviously an idiot to go sit in the corner wearing this hat and be humiliated in front of everyone. So, obviously, this meant there would be less people asking questions, which, of course, leads to if you don't know what to do and you're afraid to ask, you'll never know what to do and you fall behind further. So, again, this was not exactly a way of getting kids to learn. This was merely a way of making sure no one asked the teacher questions, making the teacher's job easier, because as long as no one asks questions, you never have to explain anything. Again, not a great way of teaching, and certainly not a great way of learning. So this is what a Victorian classroom looked like. Obviously, it may seem a bit weird at first, but it's actually quite similar to what you would be looking at in a modern school. You've got the blackboard. That is obviously the equivalent of your modern day projector or interactive whiteboard, if you've got one of those. The school bell. Now, this was rung for quiet, if the teacher ever needed quiet, but of course it was almost always quiet in a Victorian school. Students were too afraid otherwise. But you could use it to signal students for the start of a particular task, the end of a particular task, the start of the school day, the end of the school day, and lunch. Now, I have taught in schools that use this as well. So every time the bell rings, students need to stop talking. I've been in schools to this very day that use that system. You've got an abacus for counting. Now, obviously, this would be the equivalent of the calculator. Now, you've got one abacus for the entire class here, whereas nowadays, every student has a calculator or access to a calculator. The writing slate, this is so that you could hold up what you'd written down. The teacher could, instead of having to walk around the room, could see what you've done. This is also used with in a lot of schools with a whiteboard system, a mini whiteboard system that students have, so they can hold up their answers. And of course, all students must be seated at their desk. Now, these old school desks have a little inkwell there. You have a little pool of ink. You could dip your quill in, dip your pen in, so that you could then write your answers. I actually sat at a desk very similar to this when I was in grade 6 in school, because the school I went to was so underfunded, they hadn't been able to replace their desks in about 70 years. But anyway, that's a whole nother thing. Okay, this all begins to change from about 1944 because they noticed that schools are not getting the results they want. Literacy rates, the rate of people that can read and write at the accepted level, are not necessarily improving the way they want. And there's been huge changes to work. There is less work available for people who all they can do is use their hands. So for example, the production lines are becoming more mechanized. People need to read a lot more, understand instructions. People need to write a lot more. There's a lot of reports and things of this nature, instruction manuals. All of this meant that because jobs are changing, education had to change as well. So this meant by 1944, the school age, kids had to be in school till 14. This was increased to 15 later on. And state schools were put under something called local education authorities. So there was an act in 1944 called the Butler's Education Act, named after its author, okay, whose last name was Butler, and he brought in the tripartite system, 3 parts basically. So you get free grammar schools for the academically bright. That's amazing. Technical schools for the skilled or artistic, so you can learn how to be a carpenter, or you can learn how to be an electrician or things like this, or you can learn how to be a sculptor. And of course, secondary modern schools for everyone else. So everyone just goes to these schools that you just learn the same as everyone else, and you're obviously not bright enough, you don't have a very bright future, just do the work and then you can go and figure out something for yourself. Okay, And of course, this was said to be equal opportunity for all because entry to any school was based on the 11 plus, which was assessed by IQ tests, and all schools were said to have a parity of esteem. When in actual fact, there are many problems with this system. So grammar schools were still dominated by middle class or upper class children. So the lower classes are still not getting an equal fair share at education. Working class children's self-esteem was damaged because they saw themselves as failures. IQ tests are often culturally biased in favor of white middle class children and especially white middle class boys. Here is an example. So this is from an actual IQ test. Which of the following is the odd man out? Shakespeare, Blake, or Dickens? Obviously, you can all tell me of those three people. The answer is Dickens, of course. It's obvious. And the reason being, he did not write, or I should say, did not publish, he did write, he did not publish any poetry. Shakespeare published plays and poetry. Blake was indeed a famous poet. And Charles Dickens wrote more fictional stories, even though he did write poetry, but he never published it. So that was clearly obvious that everyone would know, but maybe not. So questions such as this were obviously quite targeted towards if you had read Charles Dickens as a kid, if you grew up in a household that had Charles Dickens books in it or William Shakespeare's plays in it, you're obviously going to do better on this particular test. So it's going to be skewed towards you, which means it is obviously going to be influential to the middle or upper classes. Now, there are some other problems with this system. There's not enough technical schools built. So people that want to be artists or people that want to be tradesmen, they don't actually have enough of those. So even people that have those particular talents, they've got nowhere to go. And of course, the system is incredibly unfair to girls because there's very, very few girls' grammar schools that had previously existed, and girls were deliberately marked down in exams, deliberately, because girls cannot possibly be as smart as boys. At least that's what they thought back in the day. We will see how that one turned out. Okay, and there's regional variations. There's not enough grammar schools in some areas, so many bright children were failed. So you could be an absolute genius in a country area, but there's no school to send you to, so we'll just fail you. So that way we don't need to pay to send you there, or we don't need to say, yep, you got in, but you'll never get there. We'll just fail you and send you to the regular school anyway. So it didn't really work. So because of those particular problems, the tripartite system was agreed to be a failure and a waste of talent. We had a lot of talented people that were not reaching their potential. So this meant that they realized the problem was you are wasting the talent along gender and class lines. So you've got a lot of talented people in the lower classes that just aren't getting access to education. You've got a lot of talented people in, what's that minority group called again? Oh yeah, 50% of the population, women, okay? So this is where we get the origins of modern schooling, what we would see today. Bright working class children were failing because it was so biased, so they led to the introduction of comprehensive schooling. And there is no difference in the education that anyone gets, no matter what school you go to, obviously. And that is me being facetious. Unfortunately, a lot of those problems still exist today. Now, in terms of these charts, when I said, you know, obviously back in the day, in the 40s and 50s, they thought girls could never be as clever as boys. In actual fact, statistics show that from about the 1980s, girls have been outperforming boys at school on a massive scale. Now, not every girl outperforms every boy, obviously, but if you were to take the results of 10,000 girl students and 10,000 boy students, you would have a better result from the 10,000 girls than you would from the 10,000 boys, even if the top 5 scores were all from the boys, for example. Overall, girls are attaining at a higher rate than boys. Now, there is a massive multitude of reasons that this might be the case in terms of have we perhaps gone too far the other way with testing and things skewed or having a bias away from boys? That's an argument that's been put forward. There's also arguments that, for example, things on the syllabus are just not engaging to particular boys' interests or boys' capabilities. That's another reason that this example could exist. But by far, to me, the most explanatory hypothesis put forward has to do with behavior. Girls are far more often to follow instructions of a teacher as opposed to boys. That is just a classic case. Now, that does not make girls any more intelligent, obviously. It does not make boys any less intelligent, obviously. But you can imagine if you listen to your teacher your entire school life versus you don't listen to your teacher your entire school life, that might lead to different outcomes in education. This is why oftentimes behavior in class is referred to as behavior for learning. Now, with all of that said, this does not cover about 400,000 different topics and subtopics within education, but I hope you can see that the schools that we have today have their origins in the idea that perhaps an educated society makes for a better society, and maybe, just maybe, we should be educating everyone so that everyone gets that potential. I often use this particular measurement. If you educated 100 people, you had better hope that one out of those 100 people becomes some super genius that invents, I don't know, the motor car or the airplane or something like that. Whereas if you educate 100,000 people, the odds that you're going to get at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 awesome educated people that are going to cure a disease or something along those lines is increased exponentially. So it helps all of society to help all of society with education. This is why education is good. It is no coincidence that every single successful country around the world has made leaps and bounds with education, making it compulsory and making sure their literacy rates and numeracy rates are always going up, improving, and increasing. School is good. If you take nothing else away from this particular video, take that away. School is good. Can it be better? Absolutely. Does it have some existing problems? Yes, indeed. But is it still an overall really good idea to send people to school? I hope you would agree when I say yes. Now, thank you very much for engaging with this video, and I will see you next time.